Good afternoon, everyone, again. Thanks again for joining us to the revisions for the Fellowship Application and Review Process webinar. My name is Listron Maynard-Smith. I am a Scientific Review Officer, or SRO, at the Center for Scientific Review, CSR. Today, we will be hosting this panel discussion about the changes to the Fellowship Review process. First, I'll start off with introductions. As I mentioned before, I am Listron Maynard-Smith. I am a member of the Fellowship Implementation Executive Committee and co-chair of the Training Subcommittee. The presenters today, first is Dr. Erica Boone, who is the Director of the Division of Biomedical Research Workforce at the Office of Extramural Research and the co-chair of the Fellowship Implementation Executive Committee. Next is Dr. Allison Gammy, who is the Director of the Division of Training, Workforce Development, and Diversity at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences and co-chair of the Fellowship Implementation Executive Committee. And finally, Dr. Bruce Reed, who is the Deputy Director at the Center for Scientific Review and co-chair of the Fellowship Implementation Executive Committee. We also have a few staff members who will be working in the background answering your questions in the Q&A box. Those include Dr. Kristen Kramer, Dr. Lori Ronan, Ben Roberts, Lynn Morin, and our project manager, Aditi Jain. We will be providing links to staff and public web pages in the chat, so please check throughout the session for the information and resources that will be shared there. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will be answering both pre-submitted questions as well as those submitted today in the Q&A feature in Zoom. Some will be answered live and some will receive written responses. Just note that we may not be able to answer every question today, but we do use the questions that are submitted during the webinars to translate into public-facing FAQs as well as other written materials. In addition, we have a centralized fellowship email that staff, reviewers, and applicants can use to submit questions at any time. That's fellowshipreview@mail.nih.gov. This email will also be provided in the chat. And so for the presentation, we will have 3 sections today. We're going to start off with background and motivations for change, changes to the NIH Fellowship Application and Review process, and then preparing for implementation. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Reed to begin the presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Listran. And let me welcome all our participants. I'm glad that so many of you can be here today. National Research Service Award fellowships support intensive research training for people at the pre-doctoral and postdoctoral level. The Center for Scientific Review every year reviews over 5,000 NRSA fellowship applications. So when there are concerns about fellowship review, we tend to hear about them. And back in 2021, we had been hearing concerns to the effect that the fellowship reviews may be disadvantaging some applications who were in fact highly qualified. So keeping with CSR's general commitment to making the peer review process as fair and effective as it could be, we wanted to address those concerns. So in 2021, in September of 2021, we formed a working group advisory to our National Advisory Council, charged with evaluating the fellowship review process and making recommendations to make it more fair and more effective. The members of this group largely came from outside of NIH. They were people who had personal experience both with writing and reviewing fellowship applications, and they were people deeply interested in the fellowship process. Over the next year, that group met, gathered data, looked at it, and gathered input from the public in the form of, they published a blog and got comments, analyzed those comments to get a sense of what public concerns were. So what did we hear from the public? These were the main things. We heard concerns about bias that favors big name sponsors and schools, people from well-funded labs. Concern about bias that might disadvantage early career sponsors, non-elite schools, women, underrepresented minorities. We heard requests to change the information base in the application. And by that, I mean the information that the reviewers were looking at. So one of the more frequently requested changes was that we end the requirement for undergraduate grades. People pointing out that those were not good indicators and might be harmful to applicants for a variety of reasons, unfairly so. And to reduce the emphasis on publications. And the general point was calling for NIH to more broadly consider what might make a person qualified for these fellowships. We heard concerns about the application itself. Concerns that the application was too long, that it was cumbersome, that it was duplicative, and that it was not well aligned with the review criteria. And we heard requests for enhanced training, training to reviewers about bias awareness, training to reviewers to give constructive feedback, and to try to avoid demoralizing people at this early stage of their career. I said we also got data. The data sort of reinforced these concerns. So to just show you a couple of things. So one of the findings was that fellowship submissions were highly concentrated in a small number of institutions. So looking at this graph, what you're looking at here is counts of institutions that are binned according to the number of fellowship applications that they submitted in 2021. And what you see out here at the right tail of this distribution is that there were a small number of schools that submitted a very large number of applications. So there were 15 schools that each submitted over 100 fellowship applications each year. While at the left-hand side of the distribution, you can see that there were over 100 schools that submitted only 1 or 2, and there were almost 100 more that submitted between 3 and 5 applications a year. And the obvious concern is that these schools over here did not have the same sort of experience and knowledge base to support applicants as these schools over here. And in fact, when you looked at review outcomes, you see that applications from schools that submit more applications do better in review. So here we've classified the review outcomes according to whether applications got a high impact score, or those are the blue sections of these bars. The gray section indicates the proportion of applications that were triaged, that is, that were not discussed at all. And so if you compare outcomes for schools that submitted a low number, like 1 to 10 applications, to outcomes for those that submitted a lot of applications, you see a significant difference. Schools that submitted a lot of applications, almost 44% of those ended up with high impact scores, whereas for those at only submitting a few, only about 28% were getting high impact scores. Considering the comments, looking at the data, the working group came to the conclusion that the NIH is potentially leaving out highly promising young scientists because the NRSA review process favored elite institutions, well-known scientist sponsors, and overemphasized traditional markers of early academic success. And the group made 2 major recommendations. One is revise the review criteria, the second being revise the fellowship application. So the recommendation was to revise the review criteria to focus the reviewers better on the key assessments they should be making, to define the criteria so as to give less advantaged applicants a better chance without disadvantaging anybody else, and to reduce bias in review by reducing the inappropriate consideration of sponsor and institutional reputation. The recommendations to revise the fellowship application focused on making the application align with the review criteria, to shorten it, to reduce redundancy, and to clarify where the information should appear. The group presented these recommendations to CSR's council. Council endorsed the recommendations. And then over the fall of 2022, CSR brought these to various leadership and major functional committees at the NIH. And in December of 2022, the NIH Institute directors approved these recommendations, and the senior leadership of the NIH directed that they be implemented. So before going directly to implementation, NIH wanted additional information from the community on the proposed changes, and in April of 2023, issued a request for information. This was highly publicized, and we got a good number of responses. The public input was really helpful. We heard general agreement that restructuring the criteria would result in a fairer review process, and there was general support for the proposed restructuring of the application. We also, though, heard that there was a need to clarify some of the review criteria, and we also heard many suggestions to clarify the structure of the application and what should appear where. So, in response, the NIH worked hard and took those suggestions into account in formulating the final review criteria, the final instructions for the application, and the final changes that you will be hearing about today. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Gammy.
Dr. Gammy, I think you
got you. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Bruce, to recap some of the major issues around changes. So the objectives were to focus the reviewer attention on three key assessment areas: the fellowship candidates' preparedness and potential, the research training plan, and then the commitment to the candidate. And as mentioned previously in this presentation, this was to ensure that a broad range of candidates and research training contexts can be recognized as meritorious. And this is by clarifying and simplifying the language in both the application and the review criteria. And finally, and importantly, to reduce bias in review by emphasizing the commitment to the candidate without undue consideration of the sponsor or institutional reputation. So what you may or may not know is previously in the review criteria, there were 5 topic areas, and those are listed on the left-hand side of the screen. We have now condensed them down to the 3 topic areas I just mentioned in the previous slide, and reorganized the review criteria for each of those headings. There are no additional review criteria changes or any changes to the additional review considerations. All right, so we were here. So we have revised the fellowship application. We've made it shorter, more structured, and it's better aligned with the review criteria. There's less emphasis on the sponsor track record, more emphasis on the training plan and the preparedness of the candidate. Just to mention one more time, we've eliminated the requirement to submit grades for all fellowships, made some clarification as who should be the author of each of the sections in the application, and there are corresponding changes to the reference letters that really better align with the instructions. So this slide shows you, sorry, get that out of the way. This slide shows you what is the current, on the left-hand side of the screen, the current application when you go to submit the various sections. On the right-hand side is what it will be on or after January 25th, 2025. And the blue arrows are showing you how the corresponding sections, how they be either just a direct moving over or if they have been split out. And what you can see is that it's sort of broken into the three major areas that we've been discussing: the candidate section, the research training plan section, and then there's a part that has to do with the commitment to the candidate, the mentoring and the training environment. There are, these boxes represent where attachments will be, or files will be uploaded with the different information. And I'm going to take some time in the next slide to go through, or next couple of slides, the information that is found within each of those sections. So just to give you a sense of the high-level application changes, we have simplified and reorganized. So we've gone from 12 sections to 10. We've revised the headings that will match the review criteria areas. There's a total of 4 pages that have been cut from the application, and once again, emphasizing that grades are no longer required. If you look at the categories, the 3 categories I mentioned, starting out with the candidate's goal, preparedness, and potential, the candidate will provide overall training goals, the preparedness for this particular fellowship training period. The candidate will offer a self-assessment of skills that they have and skills that they'd like to attain during the fellowship period, and also an opportunity to provide a scientific perspective. Then there's the research training plan section with several files to upload. One has to do with the training activities and timelines, and those should be closely aligned with the candidate's goals. There's a section read for the research training project specific aims. So this is the research training project. And then a section for the research training project strategy. And that will include the scientific foundation and rationale, as well as the approach. And then in the third major section of the application is an area to upload the sponsor's commitment to the candidate. This includes a mentoring approach and a specific targeted mentoring plan for the individual who's applying for the fellowship. They can also describe any prior training and mentoring to indicate their ability to mentor this individual. They should have a strong commitment to the specific research training plan that the candidate offers. They can describe the research training environment, but it really should be aligned with what this particular candidate needs in terms of training environment to complete the proposal. And then there's a section to talk about the candidate's potential, which will very much mirror this types of questions that are being asked by the referees as well. So it's sort of like the letter of recommendation there. So for those of you who are interested in where do you go to find all these various new instructions, here are some of the components that you'll need. You'll need what are called the SF424 application guide, and specifically for fellowship instructions for NIH. And you can find these at the grants.nih.gov site. And there will be specific guidelines that will be available for the January 2025 or later submission dates. Another important place to look for instruction is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, sometimes called a NOFO. And in that NOFO, you'll have any specific instructions for that funding opportunity. They may have different due dates than the standard due dates that are for NIH. It will tell you which institutes and centers participate. Importantly, also, it has information on eligibility, and that's where you need to check the eligibility as you as the candidate, whether you're eligible, and this has to do with things such as citizenship and what stage you are in your career pathway, as well as the applicant organization. It will tell you whether they are eligible to submit on your behalf. Importantly, in this NOFO, there are something called related notices, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So you find these funding announcements for the NIH-wide ones on the researchtraining.nih.gov site. And you can click on current funding opportunities when you go to that site. But you can also check on the web pages of a specific institute or center that will have links to those funding announcements. And then you can also go to the related notices section of the funding announcement, and that will tell you if a particular funding announcement has been reissued. So these related notices I want to bring your attention to, they appear within the notice of funding opportunity right at the beginning, and they will give you any updates to the instructions. So you really need these three parts when you're applying for a fellowship. When you're following the instructions, you use the funding announcement and the guide together, but if the instructions differ, you will default to the funding announcement for your instructions. If you're reading along and the notices are different from the funding announcement or the SF 424 guide, you go with the related notices for your instructions. So many of you may be asking, what can you do to get started for the January on or after the January 25th, 2025? And one thing we can point you to is these following sections: the candidate's goals, preparedness, and potential. You can start thinking about your overall training goals and what kinds of activities you would like to do and your timeline for the fellowship. You can think about your preparedness for this training and any self-assessment in terms of skills you have or you want to attain. And then there's the scientific component where you can give a broader scientific perspective. You can start crafting specific aims and a research training project strategy, including scientific foundation and rationale, as well as approach.
All right, here we go. Oh, success. Great. So now we're going to pause for a bit of a recap and a bit of a repeat for information that you have just heard over the last 21 minutes. You've heard a lot. You've heard a lot of information about the changes that have been taking place, about changes to the review criteria, changes to different sections of the application. We're just going to pause for just 1 second and just reiterate a couple of things that you just heard. So all of the changes that are mentioned today during this webinar are relevant for applications after the January 25, 2025 due date. So I've seen several questions within the chat feature asking, if I apply to the December 8th deadline, do I use the new review criteria? Do I use, or do I use the old? You're going to use the current Forms H. So the changes that you are hearing about today will be implemented after January 2025. So if you resubmit an application that you have submitted, for example, for December 8th, you're going to have to use the new format, okay? And overall, the application contains many of the same essential elements, which you just heard from Dr. Gammy. So don't be super nervous about the changes that are taking place. The revisions that are taking place currently for applications due on or after January 25 of 2025 are intended to better focus on the needs and the goals of the candidate, make the application easier to complete, and also take less time to be able to complete. There's also no need to wait for the new fellowship forms to be ready. Now, of course, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about where you might be able to find these forms when the new forms when they become available. But because some of the same elements are going to be included within the application, like, for example, the research training plan, mentorship goals and mentorship goals and plans, as well as the candidate goals, those are some of the items that you can start to work on now, as opposed to waiting until the new forms are ready. So work on these core elements right now. Also, as Dr. Gamey also just said, it is so super important for you to read the application guide. You have to know what the instructions are. There have been several questions in here about scientific perspective, right? Those are things that are going to be included within the application guide. It's going to be very important for you to read this information so that you have an indication of what things mean within the application, who's supposed to complete certain sections of the application, etc. Okay, so read the application guide. Please read that NOFO and any relevant notices. But also, just as important, please work with your mentor as you are completing these components within the application, because all of the elements within the application should be tied together to make a holistic application. So what you say your goals are should be tied into what the mentor says that you say that your goals are, for example. Also, if you have questions or you want more information, reach out to a relevant program officer. This information will be available in the NOFO under the table of IC specific information. But also, we have a web page that has been updated, that is continuously updated, that has information relevant to fellowships and the updates that are taking place with the fellowship. So if you pay attention to that particular web page, you will get all of the information that you need when it comes hot off of the presses, or you'll be able, that website will give you all of the information that you need to go find the information relevant for you to complete your application. Alrighty, so what are some of the key dates and scope of fellowship funding announcements requiring changes? So like I said before, like Dr. Gammy said before as well, when will the changes be implemented? They will be implemented for the applications with submission dates that are on or after January 25 of 2025. So for fellowships, for the bulk of fellowships, that first application due date will be April for the bulk of them. So what's the applicability? It is applicable for the following fellowships that are listed on this PowerPoint slide: F30, F31, F32, F33, and for F99, okay? These are all fellowships that utilize the F template and the fellowship SF424 supplemental form. Oh, also indicated on the slide, there's a guide notice. So check the guide notice for additional information as well. So to implementation and beyond, there have been several steps that the working group has taken in order to get us to this point and into January 25 of 2025. As I just mentioned, there was a guide notice that was released in April of 2024, so this year, that announced the intention for changes to the fellowship review and application process. Here currently in September 24, we are hosting this public webinar to alert the public to the revisions to the fellowship application and review criteria. We will make the application guide and forms packages viewable to the public and actionable to the public by mid-December. So after the fellowship application deadline, because we don't want people to be too confused about which forms to be able to use. All of the changes that we are indicating today will be live and implemented as of January 25 of 2025. And in January of 2025, we will be hosting an additional fellowship webinar, but this one will be focused on individuals that are new to the fellowship process. All right, so we're trying our best to provide you all with as much information as possible so that you are ready to be able to complete your fellowship applications readily after January 25 of 2025. Please check often this NIH grants page on fellowship changes. This will give you information and resources that are coming hot off of the presses here for NIH. You can stay tuned to what the changes are when we get any additional information. For example, if we are able to show the public any forms, ahead of time, we will give you information here on this website, and we will show you where to go, okay? So this website provides background and overview information of the changes, additional resources like I just mentioned. There are also FAQs. So a lot of the questions that you all are submitting today we turn those into FAQs so that that are searchable so that you're able to find the answer to your questions in an easy fashion. There are also some additional relevant links and additional resources on this page. So please bookmark this page so that you get relevant information about available resources, information, instructions about the application, the fellowship application and review criteria changes. Other ways to stay tuned are to sign up for the NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts. I'm hoping that you all are already signed up to this so that you can get relevant information about notices of funding opportunity, et cetera, that come out of NIH or that are published by NIH on a weekly basis. Also subscribe to the weekly guide updates as well. So this PowerPoint presentation is available for folks to be able to view and download. If you go back and check that website that I just said to you, that I just gave to you today. Also, this webinar will be available for public viewing within the next 7 to 10 days. So please come back to that fellowship update page to find as much information or all of the available information that we have about fellowship changes coming your way. Now, before I leave, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to avoid some potential submission issues, okay? The first thing is everyone always says start early, especially because we have these upcoming changes. We want for you to be as prepared as possible to submit the best application that you possibly can. Also, as Dr. Gammy said earlier, always, always, always follow all application and submission information that is contained within the Notice of Funding Opportunity or the NOFO when you are writing your application. Also follow NIH communications for funding updates. So we already talked about the NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts. We will also be utilizing social media in order to be able to communicate information regarding the fellowship application and review criteria changes. And we're also including information on LinkedIn. Also, you can get additional information on the application guide on this particular page here. So with that, I think that we are coming to a close for the more formal part of the webinar, and we will open up for questions, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Erica. And we have a lot of questions. There's a lot of engagement out there, so thank you guys so much. I have going to start off with 2 questions that I'm actually going to ask at the same time because they're very related to each other. The questions are, to clarify, grades are no longer required, but does that mean they can still be submitted and or considered? And joining that, grades are not required, but will students be penalized if they do include their grades?
So we've had a lot of consternation about the inclusion of grades within fellowship applications. And I think that people feel like sometimes grades can be used in a negative way to judge an application, right? So I would suggest to all applicants only include the information in the application that is being requested. If you're being told that grades are not going to be considered, don't think that if you put your grades in there that a reviewer is going to look at those grades and use this information in order to review your application, because we're not going to be utilizing it anymore. So I would suggest to you, include the information that is being asked. Don't worry about including anything else that's not asked. Allison?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, Bruce.
well, I was going to amplify just that. Please don't include grades. The courses that you took can be relevant to your preparation, and it's perfectly good to list courses that you've taken. But we don't want to set up a situation where people submit good grades and don't submit bad grades and have that sort of implicit judgment going on. As Erica mentioned, grades were removed for a reason, not just because they were unpopular, but because the feeling of the working group and others at NIH were that they were not a useful or fair indicator of scientific success. So please don't include them. As they say, the courses you took can be relevant, but the grades do not include those.
So
Perfect. I agree with colleagues. So yeah, go ahead,
I
Eric.
want to follow up one more thing. As Bruce indicated, there are probably courses that you took that you might want to mention in other parts of your application, right? So when you're talking about candidate preparedness, right? If you feel like there are certain courses that you took that really speak to your preparation, you should mention them there as a part of your development, but don't worry about including your transcripts.
Great, thank you guys so much. There's been a lot of changes that were discussed today, and one of the questions that keeps coming up will be, when will Forms I be ready?
So I'll jump in and just say, first thing to understand, this is not entirely in NIH's hands. So when we say we don't know, that's because we don't know. But we do have a good idea. We expect that they'll be available in mid-December. And it should be very close to that, and we will publicize it.
I can probably add a little bit to that, Bruce. We are working very closely with grants.gov. They have already they've already made available their forms to us in a lower environment, which means that we can do our coding at NIH in Assist. And we've been working with the S2S community so that they will all be ready. I spoke to grants.gov last week. They anticipate making the forms available to us in early October, which means that our colleagues at the ICs and the various offices within OER, the Office of Extramural Research, will be able to then post the new reissued NOFOs probably starting in November. So we will prioritize the NOFOs that have early due dates. There are several ICs that have their own NOFOs with due dates in February. Otherwise, again, the fellowship will be made, at least 60 days, if not even more than that, in advance of the first deadline in April.
Thanks so much, Lori. I have one more question that's focused on making sure the candidate is prepared. What does it mean to provide a scientific perspective? What would a candidate include there that isn't in the research training plan?
Yeah, I could jump in. What the working group was thinking about with this particular section is that the candidate might have a much broader scientific perspective that goes beyond the research training project that is part of the research training plan. So for example, if there's just a much bigger sense of a scientific field or where the boundaries are in that field and the important questions, that's an opportunity to talk about broader, larger scientific issues. When you start drilling into specific aims and research training project strategy, that's when you kind of dive down, and there's limited space for these types of things. And so this was thought to just give the opportunity, really thinking about the fact that what's important is an individual's their sense of thinking like a scientist. And so this is an opportunity for you to show where you can think like a scientist. So that it's not potentially going to be overly prescriptive. And so you may not have some satisfying instructions to follow, but enjoy it, have fun with it. Make it a broader, bigger perspective on the scientific field.
Yeah, there will be instructions, but I think Allison hit the key point. Someone's scientific thinking is one of the most important things to try to get at. And this is an opportunity for candidates to be able to show their ability to think scientifically.
Great, thank you. For graduate students who are planning to submit an F-31 after these changes, what are your recommendations for starting the application? Knowing that there are no examples yet, so participants are wondering whether there's a resource or email for students to get guidance on which organization to submit their F-31 to based on their aims.
I would guess that the advice to that very last question is the same, which is that there's a feature, there's two things to think about. One is your sponsor and how your sponsor is funded. And so if your sponsor is funded by a particular institute or center, that's probably a good home if your research really is falling within that area. So that's one hint. Another is if you're maybe veering off a little bit into a new area, is the NIH reporter system has something called Matchmaker, and you can paste in your specific aims and it will show you results where other scientific topics where they're most likely to be funded according to institute and center. And then if you click on fellowship specifically, you can get some contact information for people to reach out to. So I think that advice is the same regardless of the changes, is how to find the right institute or center or find the right program officer. So that guidance is the same. But what the expectations are and not having a format to follow, we appreciate that it's going to be a few rounds before you start getting applications that were funded so that you get a chance of seeing what one that's successful looked like. So, but just know that everybody's in the same boat. It's new to everyone. And so, you know, you're on an equal footing because everybody is equally, doesn't have anything to go by. And honestly, that goes back to the idea of level the playing field, is that you're all starting out on in the same place, which is new instructions, no precedent. So,
you know, I'm sorry, Erica, you want to go ahead? No, okay. I would say, you know, it's not like you should be dead in the water. There are some core things that that are absolutely the same. You should think about your scientific goals and your training goals. You know, think about what you need scientifically. What do you want out of the training? Try to define that. You should think about the research plan. You know, it's a research training project. The submitting that's going to be essentially unchanged. You still need to develop your specific aims, your approach, so forth. You can go, but and you need to think about some of the details of your training plan. You know, how is your mentor going to mentor you? How are you going to get trained in the things that you need? How do the activities you propose relate to the goals that you propose? As I say, those are sort of the fundamentals, the heart of the application. You can make a lot of progress on that now.
But one of the things, those are great answers, but also we have resources available that tell you what are some of the things that are going to be included or asked about within the application organized under the new scored review criteria. So take a look at the fellowship update webpage, because it has a lot of information that you can utilize right now to start on some of these elements that you're going to need, right? So you can worry about the page limits, you know, in a little bit, right? But I think that what you really need to be focusing on is how does the change from 5 review criteria down to 3 review criteria kind of relate to how I'm going to be thinking about how to develop the different components, you know, that are required. What's included within the candidate's preparedness and potential section? What should I be thinking about? What should I be thinking about regarding the research training plan, as well as the commitment to the candidate, which is completed by the mentor, right? So be thinking about those things, and there's information and resources available for you so that you could start right now. So like Bruce said, or Dr. Reed said, you're not dead in the water right now. There are resources available that can help you to really start to think conceptually about how you need to be moving forward.
Thank you. You guys did such a great job that she pretty much almost answered the next question, which is, will examples of applications or examples of information that belong in each of these new and reorganized sections be provided? And I think the answer to that is yes. Definitely go to the website and you will find a lot of information and resources there. Okay, so another question that has come up, how does an applicant know who should prepare or complete each section, the applicant versus the sponsor?
So we did try very hard to include that, and it's specifically, you'll find that in the SF 424 guide. So once again, I just want to emphasize that you need to read those instructions carefully, and they will tell you specifically who the author should be. And just to recap, obviously the candidate section is written by the fellowship candidate. There are most of the research training plan is also written by the candidate, but the research training project and specific aims should be in consultation with the advisor and so there's a lot of feedback that goes on, but the actual written material, the writing itself, should be by the candidate and not by any other author, because that is again a chance to see your scientific perspectives, the way you think about science and the way you communicate science. So it's very key that you be the author for those sections. Now, there's something on the responsible conduct for research, which is an incredibly important part of this, but it's understood that that is an institutionally provided curriculum. And chances are there's a standard curriculum that you can then use that standard language. And so it's understood that the candidate doesn't write that section, but it should be really integrated with the training plan and when you plan to take the responsible conduct of research, and that you're signing on to do this important curriculum. Then there's the sponsor section. And once again, the sponsor should write that. It's really where we're clear that the sponsor is all in providing support and mentoring for you as the individual. And so it's very key that the sponsor write that section. So those are just to highlight a few areas. And because authorship is really key, please pay close attention to who should be writing each section. So thank you for that question.
I think that something that Dr. Gamey just said that was super duper important is that this should be written in consultation, close consultation with your mentor.
Thanks, guys. Okay, this one is more administrative. If we submit for the December 8th deadline and resubmit after January 25th, will we need to restructure our application accordingly, including reference letters?
Yes. Yeah.
Guys,
No, I mean, that's the simple answer. Yes, you do have to, and we appreciate for people who are submitting on that cycle. It's extra work, but we have to have a clear cutover in the application materials and in the review criteria. One of the challenges that we have is training reviewers, and so you have to make it clear to reviewers what the criteria are, what they should be looking at, what should they be thinking about. And so you really can't have two sets of criteria running simultaneously. Just doesn't work very well. So yes, if you submit on that schedule, yes, you're going to have to revise or you have to restructure the resubmission.
Thank you. And following up on something you just said, Bruce, the next question is, how will reviewers be trained for the new guidelines?
Yeah, as I said, that's one of our major challenges. So we're developing guidances and training materials for reviewers. The part of the key to this effort, from my perspective, is you need to put it in front of the people who care when they care about it, which is to say, you need to put it in front of reviewers at the point that they're going to have to use it. So at CSR, we're beginning to work with SROs now so that they become familiar with these ideas. But the really big training push for reviewers is going to happen in the spring of 25, because as we explained earlier, as Erica laid out, these reviews are going to happen in the summer of 2025. So in the spring, as SROs assemble their review panels, they will be working directly with those reviewers, with those review panels to run over these changes with those people at that point.
Great. We also have, that might be another simple question. Does this apply to all T32 awards?
Does what apply to all T32 awards?
The changes that are coming up.
Oh, so changes to the T32s or to the training grants and changes to the fellowships are separate initiatives. There are web pages that are available and set up for each of these initiatives. So an individual, if they want to know more information about the training grants and changes to the training grants, which will be implemented after for application dates on or before January 25 of 2025, they should check that corresponding website on the NIH webpage. I think it's called Updates to NIH Training Grants. So it's very simply named. All the information that you need right now, except for visualization of the new forms, is available for individuals that are submitting the applications. Information about the training tables and changes to the training tables and any changes to review criteria will be available soon. So just stay tuned and make sure you check back on the updates to the training grants webpage.
Great, thank you. So we're just confirming these changes today do not apply to training grants. These are specific to fellowship applications. There's a whole separate initiative for the training grants.
Yes.
Similarly, there's a question, do the changes apply to the F99K00 applications?
Yes.
Yes. And finally, do these changes apply to K awards?
No.
Okay, so that's very good. So clearly, these changes today do not apply to K awards, do not apply to training grants, but they do apply to the F99K00 applications. Next question, does one have to be a US citizen to apply for a fellowship award?
So I can jump in there. Just taking you back to the notice of funding opportunity, and it's really key to go to the notice of funding opportunity for two areas of eligibility. The first is you as the candidate and your status as a citizen or a permanent resident is key, and then the applicant organization. So we can't say with any blanket yes, no, because each funding opportunity has unique eligibility requirements. And so you should go to the notice of funding opportunity, look at that notice of funding opportunity, and you can look now. There's really, it's unlikely that the eligibility is going to change drastically. We haven't heard of any such changes. So check the eligibility. If you were eligible prior to January, then it's likely that you will still be eligible after. That's with the caveat that you must always check. That's just good practice there too. So it's.
And I have a follow-up,
yeah.
Allison.
Yeah, sure.
Can students at foreign institutions apply?
So it depends. And so sometimes for some of the Fs, if you are a US citizen or permanent resident and you are doing your research at a foreign site, then that is sometimes okay. But there is in that particular case I'm giving you, there's a very high bar, which is that there's nowhere in the United States that you could get such training. So it's a pretty high bar for funding a fellowship outside of the United States. But once again, it depends. And then there are other situations where international students can apply, but they must be at a United States institution or organization. And so that's why we're saying it's complicated. You need to look at the funding announcement and check with the institute and center, all of those things, because you don't want to go so far down the road and find out that you were not eligible.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see if we could get a couple more questions in. Will the biosketch instructions change from Form I so that grades are not required beginning January 25th, 2025?
That's correct.
Okay, perfect. Great that we clarified that. And let's see how much more we can get in. In the sponsor section, is it still expected that the sponsor have had prior PhD students and or mentored F31 candidates previously?
That's not an expectation. That was one of the major focus of the working group. And so the sponsors given an opportunity to talk about their experience in the past, but that doesn't have to be, their very own graduate students. They might have had other mentoring experiences that come into it. So we do not want to disadvantage an early stage sponsor, early career sponsor in any way. It wasn't really a requirement, but it wasn't explicitly stated. So
what's
Okay.
key,
Go ahead, Erica.
I'm sorry. What's really key to this mentoring plan is what are the activities, what are the things that the mentor will be engaged in with the applicant to help them to advance their goals that they have identified within the fellowship application. That's what's really, truly important. Even if a person has had a very extensive mentoring history, if what they're doing for this particular candidate does not really match what their goals and their needs are, it really doesn't make a difference. So what's really going to be important here is kind of matching, what does the candidate need and what does the mentor say that they're going to be able to provide? Bruce, were you going to follow up?
Well, along those lines, just there's a diminished attention to track record and an increased attention to what is the plan for this student. And part of the goal for that is to give earlier career mentors the chance to show what their teaching, mentoring abilities, their training abilities are, and so that they have a better opportunity at succeeding as sponsors.
Great. Well, we're coming up very close to time. So to wrap up, I just want to thank everyone for your questions and comments. As I mentioned before, we were not able to answer all of the questions live today, but we will be using these questions that were submitted to develop public-facing FAQs and other written materials. So please be sure to check the website for that information. As we've mentioned throughout today, the slides and the recording from today's webinar will be posted on the event webpage in approximately 1 week, between 7 to 10 days. So again, go back and look for that. Please stay engaged with our public web pages. That's where we post all of the latest information and guidance and resources. And those links are posted in the chat once more again for your convenience. So finally, thank you so much for your participation, for your fantastic questions, and we hope that you continue to be engaged and visit the public webpage for additional information and resources.
Thank you.